Hello everyone, welcome to this talk and discussion on operating under censorship. I'm Rosie Herman, I'm a PhD researcher working in relation to the Triangle Network, and this is day 2 of the Triangle Network Forum and the 4th event in this series. So the Triangle Network Forum is a series of talks and discussions that address some of the common challenges that independent art spaces and artist collectives are facing today in different parts of the world. The forum has been enabled by the collaborative doctoral partnership established between Gasworks, the Centre for the Study of the Networked Image, and Curating Contemporary Art Programme at the Royal College of Art in London. Yesterday's talks on maintenance and precarity are available on the Triangle Network TV YouTube channel, as well as the talk on succession planning that took place earlier today. We will be adding subtitles to these soon so that they are all available in English, Spanish, and Chinese. And just to remind everyone that tomorrow we have our final plenary discussion with some of the Triangle Network partners. This will be between myself, Alessio Antonioli from Gasworks, who is the director of the Triangle Network, Candice Allison from the Bag Factory, Melina Birkenwald of URA, and Nikun from Organ House. All details of this programme and how to register can be found via the link, which should be being posted in the chat for you soon. So today we are joined by Svetlana Mintcheva, a strategy consultant focusing on issues of artistic freedom and institutional practices, and artist Jack Keaton. Svetlana will be introducing some of the key ideas and issues in relation to censorship in the arts, and Jack will share his experience in relation to censorship as well. Their presentations will be followed by discussion between the two of them. So for the forum, there'll be time for questions within this, and for the forum we've set up an Etherpad, which is to collect questions and comments from across both Zoom and YouTube, so we can gather them together in one place. And we should be sharing the link for that now, or if not, I'll post it very shortly. The Etherpad is an anonymous space, which feels appropriate for today's subject on censorship. We want a space where people can post freely. And I know that Svetlana is keen to be able to speak to the experiences of others in relation to her presentation, so please do feel free to share examples here. Finally, I just want to say that today's session is being translated with simultaneous translation into Spanish and Chinese. So please do select the interpretation options, which you'll find in the menu bar at the bottom of your Zoom if you are accessing this via Zoom. So I think that's everything from me. I'm delighted to hand over to Svetlana, who will be kicking us off today. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosie, and thanks to the Triangle Network for having me. I have to say that my experience has been primarily US centered. So I've worked with also global collectives, but just that as a framing. And I'm going to try to share my screen now, so bear with me. Okay, screen sharing. Am I sharing correctly? Rosie?
Yes, yeah, looks good.
Okay, great. So I'm going to address the issue of pressures to censor, but also as an activist, I'm interested in what you can do to resist those pressures, both acknowledging them, and sometimes when we talk about censorship, it's an endless flow of lamentation of how we're being censored. But there are ways that what we can do is important. It's not an all or nothing. We most often cannot have everything shown, but we can negotiate better. And that's particularly valid for intermediaries, for the spaces that show art. So what is censorship is kind of the fundamental question. And of course, we know government censorship. We know repressive state actors that outright ban art, ban books, ban whole exhibitions. But there is a much broader way of suppressing work, and that exceeds government censorship. They're private institutions that are in many parts of the world, the dominant in the cultural sphere. So those institutions are also subject to pressure by funders, subject to pressure from communities. So they're very vulnerable. And they also can censor. We sometimes call it self-censorship when an institution censors itself. But to an artist, it feels like censorship because it is repressing the work of an artist. We also face social media now, which is the main way a lot of artists that don't have gallery representation share work. But social media are privately owned and somewhat arbitrarily censored. For instance, photographs of nudes cannot appear anywhere on Instagram. Painting, yes, but photographs, no. So photography becomes an off-limits medium if you're photographing the body, if you're working with the body, if you're LGBTQ artist, if you're a transitioning artist who wants to highlight the body, you're banned. So we have these extra governmental ways of censoring. And then, of course, there is the recent, what people call cancel culture, calls for deplatforming. So the calls for deplatforming themselves are legitimate free speech. We can address institutions and say, you shouldn't be highlighting this or that artist. However, when an institution responds to public pressure and removes an artist from a show, refuses them a platform, that looks very much like censorship. So they're very different levels and different actors involved and different ways to resist. So these pressures are specifically very active onto intermediaries. Intermediaries I call curators, art institutions, all these that present the work of an artist to the public. And very frequently, those intermediaries bear higher costs for showing controversial work than the artists themselves do, because the artists could get, say, more publicity. They become the heroes of the censorship, but the intermediaries could lose their jobs. They could find themselves in the center of a terrible public relations crisis that is happening right now at Documenta with Ruan Grupa. They find themselves in court, as happened in the US, with high protections of free speech, but there's a museum director that was on trial for showing so-called obscene work. Or you can find yourself out of a job, and of all these. So what is the difference? What is the difference between curatorial selection and self-censorship? And curators always select. Not everything is shown, but there's a very clear difference. There may be many reasons to exclude a work or to include a work in the programming of an institution, but self-censorship is what I'd call the decision to cancel a show or exclude a work or an artist solely because of external pressure or potential external pressure and fear of controversy, fear of retaliation, fear of other repercussions. So fear is the key word here. And self-censorship is very frequently done after the fact and done for reasons that are not in line with the mission of the museum or the institution. It's done because of pressure. For instance, you cannot have an LGBTQ show because a funder may pull funds, or you fear to highlight Palestinian voices because a Jewish organization in the community may call you anti-Semitic. And you want to show this work, but you refuse to show it because of these potential problems. And these are valid issues that you should consider. Even in the United States, where I've worked most of my professional career, there's a legal regime that gives extensive protection to all kinds of speech. Even there, where museum mission statements highlight free speech as a goal of the institution, there is often the shadow of much less noble demands for funding needs. There's community and special interest pressure, and ultimately the fear of controversy. So I call this ecosystem something that fosters a structural pre-censorship. So the questions you ask, even before you put together a show, are can I show this, and at what cost? At what cost, reputational, financial, relational, to myself and the institution? So the response to these questions, that are necessary questions nowadays, maps the boundaries of what can and cannot be done, the outer limits of institutional and curatorial freedom. And this process of boundary exploration, which is also, as we explore the boundaries, we're outlining the boundaries. This is what I call structural pre-censorship. So it's not something that happens after the fact. It's something that happens in the process of deciding what to show. So you realize how freedom of speech becomes a kind of horizon of a utopian horizon that also we're pretty much censoring all the time, and we want to be able to expand those boundaries, but those boundaries exist. So the question I face and I'm trying to deal with in my practice is, how can curators and art organizers resist those various pressures and challenges that they face, both internally and externally? How can they pursue their vision, yet not have to fear for their livelihood? How can they respond to ethical imperatives without resorting to a policing based on a rigid binary of good and bad actors, acceptable and unacceptable ideas? How can they work from within a system of structural censorship that we all are in, and at the same time challenge its boundaries? So I have kind of formed a concept, and it's not my invention, it's kind of defining something that already exists, the concept of adaptive curating. And the way I define that is as curating which is both sensitive and responsive to sociocultural context. You're not doing whatever you want, you take into account the context, but nimble in negotiating internal and external pressures. So all well said, but what does that curating entail? So first and foremost, preparing to display sensitive content needs to start the preparations need to start way before an exhibition is even conceived. So there are strategies to be deployed after controversy hits, but it's really important to be prepared. And in practice, if you're prepared and if you prepared the context, you have much better chance for success. So the preparation starts early, and one component is researching the context and building networks of support. And that means researching the local context where you're working. A lot of curators work locally and they know this context, but in current times, with art biennials, with curators and museum directors traveling, there is a lot of mobility. So there needs to be a deliberate and focused effort to understand the local environment and build local networks of support wherever you go. And this is a crucial part of preparing an exhibition. Even before any exhibition is planned, curators need to research the institution's social, political, and economic context, find the key political actors and local special interest groups, and see where the social tensions lie in a particular environment. And at the same time, they need to build networks of support within both the institution and among local interest groups. And that's a kind of political labor that curators are not necessarily trained to do, but it's a very necessary political labor today if you want to actually push those boundaries. So curators need to reach out and have preliminary conversations with local stakeholders outside the institution. And you have to be careful who these stakeholders are. You don't want to prepare groups to start protesting your exhibition. You want to be working judiciously of people that might disagree with you, but will listen to your reasoning around the show. And such partnership could also help define educational programs. They could help define framing. They're not going to veto what you're going to show, but they could help you see how you're going to show it. They could send also the message that the institution is listening and offer knowledgeable and credible advocates for the show if controversy arises. And it also creates a kind of transparency of the curatorial process that helps when controversy arises. Too many times public conversations are only convened after controversy happens as a means of damage control. But conversations with stakeholders should predate a potentially controversial show, and we really don't know which one will be controversial, but frequently we know what the sensitive points are. And this is especially important for exhibitions that hit upon issues important to local interest groups. So at the same time, open discussions about programming within the institutions are also important, and as important as outreach to community groups. So everybody in the institution, from staff, that's guards, to trustees and boards, should know about the controversial aspects of a show. They could, your trustees, your board members, they participate in socio-political contexts outside of the institution. They communicate with others, and they don't want to be taken by surprise. They need to know what's in the show and how can they defend it. So it's the curator's responsibility to prepare the guards, people, staff in the institution, as well as trustees and board members and funders to answer questions about the exhibition's purpose within the general mission of the institution. So, but of course, those conversations should be a two-way exchange. They should be listening as well as preparing staff. Especially with this mobility I'm talking about to longstanding staff in an institution is very important because they know the local context, and you need to listen to them. And of course, long-term, I think that goes globally. There is a recognized need for a broader array of experience within art institutions today by hiring people of diverse backgrounds, and that's very much concern in the West right now, but it's a global concern. So aside from preparing the context, what is probably the one most important factor in when controversy arises or in managing controversy is the framing and contextualization of the work within the show, especially when it's sensitive subject matter. This includes titles, wall text, warning labels, publicity, catalogs, and involves everybody, curatorial, education, PR departments. Sometimes it's one person because it's a small institution, right? And there's been a lot of controversy around warning signs, which they're a way to protect the institution from visitor objection. If a viewer decides to proceed in spite of a warning sign, they have, in effect, consented to see something that may potentially disturb or offend them. But warning signs also have the effect of prejudicing the audience, and reinforcing taboos and framing certain subject matter as inherently problematic. And that also privileges the assumption that there is certain subject matter, that there's a right not to be offended, and certain subject matter offends. So it's complicated, but most art institutions resort to warning labels as the way to protect themselves. And the presence of children remains one of the most important audience-related factors driving signage, as well as decisions about how to lay out a show. Indeed, most frequently, warning signs are about visitors seeing a show that's inappropriate for children. And lastly, but very importantly today, an exhibition is formed by the publicity around it. And a lot of it is publicity circulated widely on social media. And such publicity can have major impact. Positive is good because it's broadly reaching, but it could be, elements of the show could be taken out of context, and there could be opposition. So you have to be very careful, and I could talk about that at length, about how a show is advertised on social media, where the message goes to an audience that's not necessarily in the museum, an audience that might have a very different interest in taking up elements of your show and working towards their own agenda. So kind of to conclude, controversy just cannot be entirely avoided, but being prepared makes a difference. And of course, no matter how well prepared, how well framed a show is, and how much work a curator has done with the community ahead of it, protests may still materialize. But when they do, and when you have allies to stand beside you, that makes all the difference. And you need speed and you need reach. And both of them need advanced preparedness. So this is key to responding to controversy and managing to control the narrative, especially in this age of social media. So what I call those adaptive curatorial strategies can go far in meeting the challenges of our polarized environment, where protest campaigns can quickly and cheaply acquire hundreds of thousands of clicks online, and where the visibility of art institutions make them desirable targets for publicity for any kind of cause, also desirable targets for government, to more repressive governments, to send a message. So more than ever, art institutions need the leadership of prepared risk takers, equipped to preserve the greatest amount of artistic freedom that we can afford in a particular environment. So, thank you.
Thank you, Svetlana. I'm now going to hand over to Jack, and then we can start a discussion between the two of you. Thank you.
Hi. Hello, everyone. I would like to start my talk by actually just offering a confession to you all, basically, which is that I have been attempting to write a script because, we were advised to kind of, if we had any script ready, it would be helpful to the interpreters. And I was also like writing this script for the last few days and trying to write a PowerPoint as well, presentation. But I have been having this growing sinking feeling in my stomach as the session approached. And right now I'm fighting the urge to fall asleep as a kind of flight response from this session, because I kind of realize now I don't want to do this session. And I was thinking this morning, why have I agreed to do the session on censorship? It scares the pants off me. And of course I kind of said yes, because I know of the Triangle Network. I've respected the work of the Triangle Network, and I really rate Gasworks, which is why when I was invited, I just said yes, okay. But actually, as this session neared, I'm just like feeling like lethargic. Like when I tried to write my script, I just felt lethargic. I felt like I was allowing myself to be distracted, to go and do other things instead of preparing for today's session. And I couldn't understand what was going on. And I realized that having to present my work and talk about censorship brings back all the feelings and bodily responses to censorship itself and the censorship that I have experienced in my life. So I don't have a script for you, and I don't have a PowerPoint for you, because the way in which censorship and self-censorship, or the echoes of it, or the ghosts of it within this session, has kind of really stopped me from actually kind of giving you a proper script and a PowerPoint. So I think that's just kind of where I am at the moment. And I just wanted to kind of say that I wanted to present the very the very performative of censorship and self-censorship right here in this meeting. And it's interesting because I did a talk yesterday. I led a 2-hour workshop yesterday for another like this one, another workshop, preparing for it. And there was absolutely like really no problem. I wrote a script, did a PowerPoint, just, you know, so it's not that I can't do PowerPoints. It's just there's something about today's there's a kind of somatic dynamic going on when it's to do with censorship. But what I wanted to talk to you about, I will run through what I wanted to talk to you about and what that PowerPoint should have been. So I'm going to share my screen with you of this image that is what I wanted to talk about, which is this image of a panopticon. And if you don't know what a panopticon is, it is a prison. So where the prison cells are around the edge of a circle, and the prison guard or the prison tower is in the middle. And often, you know, this is a very generous panopticon. Often the panopticon is one where the prisoners cannot see the guards, because, you know, if you imagine this where it could have like one-way mirrors or kind of like shaded windows, so you can't see the guards. You don't even know if the guards are there. But they can see you. And so there's this kind of all-seeing eye, which is what I want to talk about in terms of the idea of self-censorship. So in my work, I suppose my context is in Singapore and in the UK. So in my context, in Singapore at least, the panopticon is made quite explicit through this idea of a concept called out of bounds markers, or what they call OB markers. So I'm going to share you an image of what an OB marker is. Okay. This is an OB marker, or these things are OB markers. So this is a golf course near my house, actually, in Scotland. And these are OB markers, which means that if you hit the golf ball out, it's out of bounds. So anything on this side is out of bounds. So you're not allowed to go out of bounds. And, you know, I don't know much about golf, unfortunately, but I assume that it means that your play is invalid, I suppose, for that shot. So within the Singapore context, on a project that I did with I was asked, what are your OB markers? I didn't even know what that meant. And so I had to go, what is an OB marker? And they had to say to me, you know, like, your work won't touch things like religion or politics or sexuality. So I was asked to identify my own OB markers. So there are also no sets of OB markers. There's no like a statute of OB markers. They are simply a set of boundaries in society where you're not allowed to go beyond, but nobody quite knows what the exact boundaries are. So we know generally it's to do with religion. Generally, it's to do with don't say anything that incites racial violence or racial tensions. Generally, don't talk about or promote sexual or talk about sexuality. But then, you know, if you go online and Google OB markers, Singapore, some of the OB markers have been very unusual. Like there's not even anything to do with religion. It could be something somebody has said that's nothing to do with any of those things explicitly, but you only know that you've crossed the line when you've said it. And then you get the backlash, and then you know you've crossed the line. But by then it's too late because you don't know what the line was. So I think those were a number of issues which made me very anxious as somebody trying to make art in an environment where the censorship boundaries were not clear, and are often just made up as you go along, because the OB markers are dependent on the sensitivities of society and politics at that time. So at that time, for example, I would have not been able to make any work that promotes a kind of empathetic understanding of sexuality. But that might have changed now, because ministers and other high influence individuals have now begun to talk about sexuality in the country in an open way. So now the OB markers might have shifted, but you sort of need to know where those are. But that causes a lot of stress for an artist on knowing what line have you crossed or not. And then curatorially, in my experience of some work in Singapore, I also don't quite know when a curator says, we don't think you should do this, whether that's to do with the work's bad or your idea is bad, or whether you've somehow touched something sensitive, but we don't quite know. So it makes the curatorial process quite blurred and confusing for an artist as well. So I think that's kind of OB markers, which is what I wanted to talk about. The other points of censorship that I've come across are confidentiality clauses or non-disclosure clauses within artist contracts. And those are problematic for me because they are often very too broad. So a lot of confidentiality clauses are just don't say anything about anything we've done to anyone. I mean, it's almost like this kind of massive secrecy clause. And that, again, operates under a kind of, well, what can I say that about the work that is acceptable? At what point in time do I say too much that then I end up breaching a clause of the contract? The other clauses that I've had in Singapore, which is quite explicit, is the clawback funding clauses that exist in artist contracts. So it will say in there that if you say anything or do anything that either brings the organization into disrepute or it is against an OB marker, they will be able to claim back all the money that they've given you for the work, even if the work's been done and you spent the money. So that was kind of like broadly my Singapore experience. And I mean, I'm just talking in terms of censorship. There were good experiences too. But of course, the non-disclosure clauses happen here as well. And in terms of contracts that I've experienced here, I mean, two cases in particular where we either whistleblow and a group of us whistleblew and our contracts were terminated straight away. And then literally just last week, I had a contract terminated on me because I framed an email. I sent an email that was kind of framed in a way that was a grievance about the curatorial quality around my work. And normally I would think that would kind of go into a back and forth about, meetings and let's just work this out. But what happened immediately was termination. I just got an email the very next day just saying, we don't like the tone of your email. We are terminating your contract. And so that's the kind of conditions where, I mean, as an artist, I feel like, well, that contract you've just terminated, that kind of was a quarter or a third of my year's income, but you've terminated without notice because I said something you didn't like. I've criticized something about your practice that you didn't like, so I'm deleted. For me, the idea of erasure is quite very race specific for me, because within the UK, there is a long history of Chinese erasure or East and Southeast Asian erasure. So we go from the history of the Liverpool merchant seamen who were deported overnight after the Second World War because the Chinese population here were deemed to be inconvenient. And so just erasure straight away. So the kind of use of Chinese labor and then erasing it as soon as you don't want it anymore. And that also comes in the backdrop of the transatlantic experience of the Chinese Exclusion Acts, the use of Chinese labor in as strike breaking, so it's very disposable labor. So for me, this kind of unilateral termination of my labor has to be seen for me within the context of a racialized dynamic happening. So it's been problematic with the kind of the way institutions feel that they can remove artists without any acknowledgement of their precarity. As freelance independent artists, we are not gallery artists who show at Frieze. We're the kind of artists that work a lot on the ground. So a lot of us are precarious. So just kind of immediate termination, and then on top of that, blacklisting really becomes a threat, in which we then kind of think, well, maybe the next project, I just better not say anything, So it's not so much about what you can't say in your artwork, right? Because a lot of institutions will be like, no, it's freedom of expression. We want to support you being freely to express as controversial things as you want in your artwork, in the gallery. Just don't criticize us. Don't say anything about us, right? If you say stuff about us, then there's a kind of fragility there. So it's really problematic where the gallery is robust, but the organization is fragile, So the gallery program is robust in terms of censorship, but the organization itself is fragile in that sense. And then I think finally, what I want to also mention is that the other thing in my precarity, especially in the United Kingdom, is to do with what I kind of have started thinking of as a meta censorship. So I'm here as a permanent resident. So I'm not a citizen of the United Kingdom. So as a permanent resident, in many, many places, you can't really do things that are too much freedom of expression, because there are certain things that I feel I can't touch for fear of getting my residency revoked. And it's obvious, they say you can't do anything criminal or anything like that, but often it's also but the problem in the UK is that what's acceptable has begun to shift when we in the UK have changed our nationality laws to the point now that the UK can strip you of your citizenship if it thinks that you are doing something that is a threat to the nation. So since 2005, the UK has had the ability to just remove a person born here as a citizen, to just strip them of their citizenship. And there is a bill going through Parliament right now where the proposal is to give the government the ability to strip your citizenship in secret, so without notice. So you could just come back one day and just not be let in because you're no longer a citizen. So I think, so the issue there, I think, is that for me, even as somebody, if a citizen doesn't have the security of being able to express themselves freely, what less security I have as somebody who's simply somebody who has indefinite leave to remain. So there are kind of, and so very practically, that means for me, like I wouldn't make any work that is critiquing or looking into much detail at, for example, the Ministry of Defence, for example, even though I have lots of stuff to say about the Ministry of Defence, since in my previous incarnation, I did a lot of work, pro bono work, as a lawyer for soldiers suffering post-traumatic stress disorder. So, I mean, there's a range of work that I was thinking, oh yeah, I would be very interesting to look at that, you know, to look at war trauma and the Ministry of Defense liability and duty of care. But I would, in my head, I just go, okay, I'm just not going to touch that. It's just too hot for me. And for me, that's to do with a kind of a meta censorship going on. Yeah, so with that, I think I just finished there, talking about the different points of encounter of censorship that I've experienced. Thank you.
It's interesting, Jack, that I mean the Singapore OB markers sound almost refreshing. I mean, first of all, it seems like you have it everywhere. You have the undefined markers, but you go to the UK and you have a sort of more stated support for free speech, whereas the unspoken OB markers are there as well, and maybe even more. Because they're not explicit, because you're living in a regime that's not a censorship regime. At the same time, you also have to guess what the boundaries are. And I kind of always think that, you know, you have this division between more repressive regimes and liberal democracies, and liberal democracies have all these invisible structural things that are in place that limit what you can say, and, you know, send you this message that there are consequences. So I kind of, my first question was, what are the consequences in Singapore if you transgress the OB markers? Because clearly in the UK, then you get your contract canceled and you don't have a show, or you can get your citizenship canceled, which is serious. But what is it in Singapore? What's the...
I think I don't know, I've never crossed an OP marker, I don't. But I think it's to do with, I think there are probably a range, I'm not too sure, but there are probably a range of legal statutes or laws that if you've crossed the OB marker, that these come into play, basically. So the OB marker is not like an official thing. It was like a metaphor that was used in Parliament, and then it just took on. So in a way, the OB marker is a metaphor for the range of laws that you could be contravening. And it's a really useful metaphor for kind of saying, okay, this is what the range of laws are. And it could be anything from internal security to obscenity, you know, racial, religious hatred, to whatever information laws at the moment. So, but I think I agree with you that what's refreshing about it is that they are upfront about it, right? Because I think there are OB markers in the UK, and you also just don't know, but I suppose in the UK we don't like to think we have them. You know, it's almost like because we're meant to be a free democracy, so we don't like to say we have OB markers. But I think you're absolutely right, we do. And because they're not explicit, they're harder to pin down. So because the concept is explicit in Singapore, if you go online to like an academic database, you'll find researchers like writing about OB markers. So it's almost like a concept that can be pinned down itself, even though the content can't be pinned down. But here we can't even talk about it. You know?
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you about that, to explain more about that contract that got canceled on you. What that they said, if you want to share more, because it wasn't last week.
Last week, still quite traumatic. Yeah, I mean, it was just that, and I mean, it's not just last week. It happens all the time, where if you just, because we're all freelancers, right? So we don't have employment rights as artists. So it's just really easy for institutions to just cancel the contract. So for me last week, it was just that I had been dissatisfied with the project over the last 3 months. So I sent an email that was quite strongly worded about listing, this is what I think we need to deal with. And I said, let's meet tomorrow, since we're planning to meet tomorrow, let's dedicate some time to discuss this. And the response, though, to that email was, I'm sorry, we're giving you notice of immediate termination of contract. So, and that's really, I don't have employment rights, so I can't say you can't terminate. You've got to go through a redundancy process or anything. So that really is, it puts, so now I'm going on to my next project, and now I'm thinking, wow, I better not say anything in my next project. I better not be too critical. Or
you were criticizing the sort of the organizational curatorial process.
Yeah. So yeah, I think it's difficult. I think, and it links into kind of what your project, your presentation was, Svetlana, about what for me is at what point do institutions censor others as well, right? So they have to deal with the censorship pressures, but the pressures that they also assert on others,
Well, that's what it is, because institutional self-censorship is self-censorship insofar as it's not government censorship. On the other hand, when an institution censors itself, it's censoring its own voice, but it's actually, because it speaks through artists, it is censoring to the artists, an institution self-censoring. Say, I'm a curator and I'm concerned about showing something with racial content, which happens a lot. And I tell you, we cannot show this work of yours. To you, that feels very much like censorship. It's self-censorship because it's, the institution is allowed to do it. It very frequently is unnoticed because, as your contract probably, once the show is out, that will not be public. So you don't know. The public doesn't have insight in what happens in institutional decision-making. And it's also, there's no legal protections. If, say, the mayor of New York comes to the Brooklyn Museum and says, take this painting out, the Brooklyn Museum could say no. If a curator comes to you, Jack, and say, I have decided to exclude your work from the show, you have no recourse. And the curator is doing it, and they're, they're in a very difficult position. On the one hand, there's the artist, and the artist wants their vision, and they exercise certain pressure on the curator. On the other side, there's the institution, the reputation of the institution, the funders maintaining the funding of the institution, maintaining its, working with its board. So there's this middle figure of the curator, which is in an interesting position that I'm sympathetic to because I can see the pressures, but from the point of view of the artist, and I've been in these situations from the point of view of the artist, it's like, what? You're refusing my work. But one has to recognize that the whole ecosphere we're dealing with is complicated, and that nobody's entirely a free agent. So that's why I work a lot with curators, saying how curators could push the OB markers so that artists could have more freedom to express themselves, but push the OB markers in a way that is not going to create bad publicity or a terrible scandal, and they, get out of control of the narrative, which is, I think documentary is a good example now of what is going on when the curatorial, the organizing collective doesn't control the narrative anymore. They get into this position of guilt, and right now documentary the whole future of documentary is threatened because of this moment of failure and activation of political forces that are taking this opportunity, because it's a complex environment, and that's, when you're thinking just about the art and just about the curator selecting the art, we're not thinking that this happens in a social-cultural environment full of OB markers. I'm going to use those OB markers now very widely. I think they should be they should be made explicit in the West.
Yeah. I think also especially within the context of the UK, we have a culture war going on. I'm sure it's happening in the USA as well, a culture war going on.
Same one.
Yeah. Where I feel censorship is happening, not directly, because those are like the real, those are difficult, but they're the explicit ways of censoring. If you have an anti-Semitic or a racist work of art, it's very clear. We will target that and we will censor that. But like here in the UK, for example, in the culture wars, for example, what's being censored is bureaucratic values, right? So, for example, last year, a trustee from the Royal Greenwich Museum, who was being recommended to be a trustee of this major museum in South London, was blocked because he was an academic who wrote and does a lot of research about anti-racism and decolonization. So this word decolonization is kind of controversial in that the government is waging a culture war against this word, shall we say, against woke, shall we say, and so that's fine. I mean, I think you're free to express your disdain for those kinds of movements, but to then block a trustee who is an expert in that from sitting on a major museum, I think that's where the censorship goes. So the entire person is erased, which means their entire worldview and what they can contribute to an organization is removed. So their voice is completely removed and everything they represent. And that's the kind of insidious thing for me. It's like boards of trustees are being curated in a way that the whole sets of values of the organization become censored. Yeah, and like you say, it's complex.
Yeah, and I think it's a very good point that you bring up the board of trustees, because you have organizations that are led increasingly by people that come not from an art background, but from a business background,
Yep.
especially larger institutions that are they're multi-million dollar or euro or pound sterling enterprises. So fundraising is important there, managing these big endowments, if they are fortunate to have an endowment. So you have art institutions run like corporations, and the corporations function in a very different way. So from art and art people led institutions, we're coming to institutions that are mostly corporate led, and then the risk averseness goes up.
Yes. So I would add there, Svetlana, that a corporation, making corporations approach to censorship, or its understanding of censorship, is different from, say, what a museum's understanding of censorship should be, right? I mean, I imagine that the way a corporation configures censorship is one in which it's just afraid of its reputation being harmed and its sales going down, right? So it will censor stuff that threatens profit. And for me, it's a real wrong set of values to import into a museum's understanding of censorship, because for a museum, I think it's to do with or museum or art gallery, its negotiation with censorship it's complex. It has to do with ensuring freedom, balancing freedom of expression with advancing its purpose of showing art and being a steward of the country's culture, right? And it's not just about we're afraid, like you say, risk averse. We're afraid that we're going to get a backlash. So maybe what I'm saying is that there are different approaches to censorship, and museums should stick to a kind of cultural understanding of censorship rather than adopting the business understanding of censorship. Because I understand. Yeah.
Yeah, but it doesn't help when they are big corporations. But I think most of the members of the Triangle Network are smaller spaces, and I think my hope is with smaller spaces because they're sometimes they're under the radar, but that helps being able to show content that could be was too risky for a museum to show. And in arts, experimentation, even making mistakes, is so important. And when you experiment, you're going to make mistakes. A big institution cannot afford to make mistakes. They need to maintain their funding levels. They can't. But the small institution, because it's small, because it's already working on a shoestring, can afford to be more experimental. Of course, the flip side of that is for a small institution to handle scandal or kind of government backlash is much more difficult. They don't have a huge PR department. There's no big legal recourse. So they're more vulnerable, at the same time, kind of more able to be in those spaces of experimentation. And I wanted to ask you whether you find any kind of difference between working with a larger institution and a small organization, if you have any experience with that.
In relation to censorship, you mean? In relation to
Yeah,
whether they censor?
in relation to the freedom that you have to experiment. I mean, it might not come to censorship precisely, but how much
freedom.
How do you feel the OB markers are?
It just depends on which country you're in. I feel like maybe like in Singapore. I mean, again, I'm not work a huge amount in Singapore, but I kind of feel like the pressures for small organizations are probably the same as big organizations in terms of how much they mustn't go past the OB markers. Because I think due to the history of Singapore itself as having quite a tumultuous history after the war, the country is very sensitive to things that might cause public disorder. In the UK, I feel like, you know what, I think it depends on the organization. Like some big organizations that I've worked with have been very good at, responding and really fighting for freedom of expression. And conversely, some small organizations have been very, very fearful of it. But then the other side is true. I think it really depends on the organization. And I would say also it depends on, even in the UK, it depends on where you are in the UK, because different parts of the country have different local cultures. Like you would say, to generalize, it would be like, oh, people in the Northwest are much more open and they'll say it like it is. They'll tell it like it is. They'll be much more direct and honest is a kind of stereotype, which then I think if that's the cultural stereotype of that region, then it allows more to be said officially, in organizations, as opposed to the other parts of the country that might be much more like, you can't say things directly to people. You've got to say things in a roundabout way. So maybe it's to do with localized culture as well. I don't know.
Yeah, local context we found matters a lot. And you have to know the local context and how much, and it's and the lines fall differently. In one local context, you cannot do anything around sexuality. In another, it's religion. Then there's issues of Israel, Palestine, the kind of the.
Right. Yeah. So absolutely. I think, like you say, it's complex and everything is like intersectional. Like censorship itself is intersectional. So it depends on what factors are at play, and maybe what needs to happen is a kind of, like you say, what you're proposing is a kind of preparation, like prepare carefully and understand what all the factors are at play. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm reminded that we need to wrap up, but I think it's while acknowledging all these OB markers everywhere, I think it's really important to kind of learn from each other and to try to open up, to see how we can be more prepared, see how we can work with local context, and realizing that we cannot have total freedom of expression, to see how we can push the boundaries a little and not self-censor, second guessing ourselves, oh, would that be a repressive OB marker, or could we go there? Let's try to go there a little bit, but be prepared.
That seems like a perfect moment to maybe end this session. I'm sorry that we've run out of time for any questions. I didn't want to interrupt the conversation because it was so interesting, and I felt that you were exploring so many different areas that are so pertinent to this conversation. But just to let people know that the Etherpad is still live, so you can post things afterwards if you just want to share your comments. I know that Alessio has posted a comment in the chat to just kind of thank you both for today, and I wanted to echo that. I think the kind of presentation that you set out, Svetlana, and kind of doing that mapping and introducing the key terms was really useful. And I just wanted to say thank you as well, Jack, for being really honest about the difficulties of even being here today. And I just want to say how appreciated it is that you have kind of shared that experience. And as Alessio said in his comment, I feel like it will be really valuable to others who are also trying to kind of get to grips with some of these ideas that you've both talked about so well this afternoon, or this evening, or the morning, wherever you are in the world. So I just want to say a big thank you again to both of you. And it feels like there's some work to do, there's some thinking to do for everyone going forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you.